The lights of the studio gleamed with polished perfection, the kind of glow that made every expression, every twitch of the face, impossible to miss. Oprah Winfrey leaned forward, her voice rich with practiced authority, the same voice that had defined decades of American television. But this time it wasn't warm, it wasn't welcoming. It carried a sharp edge, a patronizing rhythm, as though every syllable had been dipped in condescension. She fixed her gaze on Jasmine Crockett, her tone descending into the kind of lecture that told the world who held the power in the room. Oprah framed her words like a teacher scolding a child, each sentence delivered with the confidence of someone used to winning every room she entered. The audience shifted uncomfortably, torn between awe at the cultural titan and unease at the sting of her words. Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't break eye contact. Her posture remained steady, shoulders square, hands calm on the table. The cameras caught the stillness in her face, no panic, no flustered defense, just a patience that felt almost defiant. And in that silence, in that unshaken presence, a different kind of power was beginning to build. The crowd sensed it. You could hear breaths being held, the kind of hush that falls right before thunder strikes. Oprah's words grew sharper, as though she could force Crockett into a stumble. But the more she pushed, the more it became clear that something unusual was happening. The imbalance of power wasn't working. Narration cut in like the voice of history itself. No one could believe what Oprah just said on national television. A cultural icon attempting to put a rising voice in her place. Live, unedited, unfiltered. It was a clash no producer could have scripted better, a collision of eras and egos, authority against authenticity. And there sat Jasmine Crockett, eyes steady, waiting. Her silence wasn't weakness, it was a fuse burning toward an inevitable explosion. The audience didn't know it yet, but they were seconds away from witnessing the kind of response that doesn't just go viral. It rewrites reputations. Because in just moments, Crockett would open her mouth, and Oprah Winfrey would regret ever underestimating her. But before that counterstrike shook the studio, America needed to understand why this moment mattered so deeply. To understand the weight of this clash, you have to step back and recognize who sat on each side of that table. Oprah Winfrey wasn't just another television personality. She was a cultural institution. For decades, her voice had been the voice America turned to when it wanted comfort, guidance, even moral clarity. Her rise from poverty to billionaire mogul had been written into the American myth itself. She could crown books as bestsellers with a single nod, shape political conversations with a single endorsement, and shift the national mood with just one heartfelt moment on her stage. When Oprah spoke, people listened, not because they had to, but because they believed they should. That was the kind of power she carried into the studio that night. And sitting across from her was Jasmine Crockett, a fresh face to many Americans, but hardly a novice to standing her ground. Crockett wasn't backed by decades of fame or a media empire. She carried no billionaire brand, no chorus of television producers polishing her every moment. What she had was something both rarer, and in that moment, far more dangerous: authenticity. She wasn't trying to be polished for the cameras. She wasn't bending to the weight of celebrity. She was simply herself, sharp, unflinching, and unapologetically direct. That contrast is what made the confrontation electric. For years, Oprah had been the unquestioned authority in rooms like these. She wasn't used to resistance that couldn't be smoothed over with charm or silence with gravitas. But Crockett wasn't playing by those rules. To the millions watching, it was a collision of two Americas: the polished cultural giant who symbolized legacy power, and the insurgent voice of a new generation that refused to be lectured into silence. The imbalance of power was obvious. One woman had shaped the very definition of television history, while the other was still introducing herself to much of the country. That imbalance should have guaranteed an easy victory for Oprah. It should have meant Crockett would nod politely, defer, and accept the lecture. That's the script everyone expected, and the very script that Crockett was about to shatter. Because this wasn't just about two women disagreeing on live television. It was about what happens when authority is challenged by authenticity. It was about whether America still bows to celebrity power or whether it stands up for the raw, unvarnished truth of lived experience. Millions of viewers weren't just watching a debate. They were watching themselves reflected in the moment. Immigrants who had been talked down to, women who had been told to wait their turn, young leaders who had been dismissed by the old guard. Every one of them saw something familiar in the way Crockett absorbed the sting of Oprah's words without breaking. The stakes grew larger with every second of silence that passed between Oprah's lecture and Crockett's impending reply. This wasn't a skirmish over policy or opinion. It was about dignity itself. It was about whether the world still belonged to those who believed their status made them untouchable, or whether the tide was turning toward those who carried nothing but their own voice and conviction. And when Crockett finally spoke, it became clear this was never just about her. This was about all of us. But before America heard the counterstrike that would leave Oprah stunned, it was worth remembering why the weight of Oprah's authority mattered so much, and why her history made this fall from grace so unforgettable. For generations, Oprah Winfrey's name had been synonymous with triumph. Her story, the girl who rose from rural poverty in Mississippi to become one of the most powerful women in the world, was the ultimate American fable. She built her empire brick by brick, with empathy as her currency and storytelling as her weapon. Millions tuned in daily to her talk show not only for entertainment, but for guidance. In living rooms across the nation, her voice carried the weight of wisdom, a soothing authority that seemed beyond question. That authority did not fade when her show ended. It only grew. With a media network, publishing deals, and billion-dollar ventures, Oprah was no longer just a TV host. She was a brand unto herself, a walking symbol of achievement and influence. When Oprah endorsed Barack Obama, it was said to have moved millions of votes. When she recommended a book, it climbed the charts in days. And when she spoke on moral questions, she often did so with a tone that suggested she was delivering not opinion, but truth. But with such a legacy came contradictions. For all her talk of empowerment, critics often accused her of being out of touch with the very people she once claimed to represent. The billionaire lifestyle, sprawling estates, luxury brands, private jets, seemed far removed from the audiences who first embraced her as one of their own. The warmth and compassion she built her reputation on could sometimes harden into something else, a sharp, lecturing edge, especially when she felt her perspective was unassailable. That tendency gave birth to what her detractors called lecture culture. Oprah was seen as someone who not only offered advice but demanded deference. When she spoke, you were expected to nod, to accept, to fall in line. And when guests dared to push back, the moments could turn icy fast. To critics, it wasn't inspiration anymore, it was elitism, coded in the language of empowerment. There had been controversies before. Interviews where Oprah was accused of talking down to her guests, moments when her aura of moral authority felt less like mentorship and more like dominance. And with every passing year, that tension grew sharper. Was Oprah still the voice of the people, or had she become an untouchable icon insulated by fame and fortune? That question lingered heavily the night she faced Jasmine Crockett. The audience knew Oprah's history. They knew her power. Her words didn't land in a vacuum. They landed with the weight of decades, with the assumption that whoever sat across from her was automatically in the position of student, not equal. And that assumption made what followed even more dramatic, because the irony of Oprah's authority was that it carried both respect and resentment. People admired her rise, but they also resented the way she sometimes wielded her success like a shield. For those who felt dismissed by elites, Oprah became a paradox, the proof that one could succeed against all odds, but also the reminder that even those who had once struggled could become detached, even arrogant, once they reached the summit. It was that duality, admiration and frustration, that filled the studio air as Oprah leaned into her lecture of Jasmine Crockett. On the surface, it was the same old pattern, Oprah setting the terms, Oprah commanding the moment. But beneath it, viewers felt the tension. Would Crockett fall in line, as so many before her had done? Or would she do the unthinkable, interrupt the narrative and refuse to be schooled? Oprah had every reason to expect control. For decades, no one had dared seize the microphone from her in such a space. And that was precisely why the stakes were so high, and why her words, dripping with condescension, carried more than just arrogance. They carried history. History of deference, of silence, of countless people being told their voices were smaller than hers. But Oprah didn't realize that Jasmine Crockett had come prepared for this very dynamic. Crockett wasn't intimidated by legacy or blinded by celebrity shine. She wasn't here to be folded neatly into someone else's story. She was here to write her own. And in that studio, under the gleaming lights and the hush of anticipation, Oprah Winfrey believed she was in control. She believed the weight of her legacy would silence resistance. She believed she was untouchable. But what Oprah didn't know was that Jasmine Crockett was ready. Jasmine Crockett's presence in that studio was no accident, nor was it a stroke of luck. It was the product of a life shaped by resilience, sharpened by struggle, and defined by a refusal to be silenced. Long before she sat across from Oprah Winfrey, long before cameras captured her unshakable calm, Crockett was a young woman growing up in a working-class family that knew what it meant to fight for every inch of progress. Her childhood wasn't gilded with wealth or fame. It was built on long days, hard work, and the quiet lessons of dignity her family passed down at the dinner table. She knew what it was like to feel the weight of expectation pressing on her shoulders, not because anyone thought she couldn't succeed, but because everyone knew she had to. For herself, for her family, for her community. Each obstacle she faced wasn't a barrier meant to stop her, It was a test designed to see if she would push through. And every time she did. From an early age, Crockett carried herself with the kind of confidence that didn't come from privilege but from necessity. In classrooms where others doubted her, she sharpened her voice. In spaces where she wasn't expected to belong, she carved out her place. When others told her to wait her turn, she asked why dignity should ever be deferred. Those moments shaped the leader she would become, not in spite of hardship but because of it. As she entered public service, Crockett's reputation grew quickly. She was the one who spoke up when the room went quiet. Whether it was in heated committee hearings or high-stakes debates, she showed no fear in locking eyes with those who underestimated her. Her speeches weren't polished with PR gloss, they carried the edge of lived experience. When she talked about inequality, it wasn't theoretical, it was personal. When she challenged injustice, it wasn't abstract, it was rooted in stories she had lived or seen firsthand. And with every battle she fought, she built something far more enduring than a resume. She built authenticity. She wasn't trying to imitate anyone else's voice or mannerisms. She wasn't sculpting herself to please a camera or a donor. She was Jasmine Crockett, raw and real, and that authenticity made people lean in. It was the reason her supporters trusted her, and the reason her opponents feared her. There were countless moments that tested her resolve, rooms where she was outnumbered, debates where she was written off before she even spoke, interviews where the odds were stacked against her. And yet, time and again she rose. The pressure didn't crush her, it clarified her. In the fire of high-pressure moments, Crockett had learned not just how to survive but how to thrive. That history mattered in the studio with Oprah. Because when Oprah's words dripped with condescension, Crockett wasn't rattled. She had faced sharper dismissals in her life. She had stood in rooms where people looked right through her. She had been told in subtle and not so subtle ways that she didn't belong. And every time she had responded not with surrender but with resolve. She knew what it was like to carry the weight of other people's doubt. She knew the sting of being underestimated, of being reduced to a caricature by those who never bothered to understand her story. And perhaps most importantly, she knew the power of refusing to internalize those attempts to diminish her. That was her armor, the lessons of every struggle, every slight, every barrier she had broken through. So when Oprah leaned in, voice heavy with the authority of her empire, Crockett sat steady. She wasn't cowed because she had already lived through harder moments. She wasn't intimidated because she had already proven herself in spaces where the stakes were life-defining. She didn't need to raise her voice, because the strength of her presence came from a deeper place, from resilience, from authenticity, from the long road she had already walked. The audience watching may not have known every detail of her journey, but they felt it. They felt it in her calm. They felt it in her refusal to shrink. They felt it in the quiet power of a woman who had fought too hard, sacrificed too much to let anyone, not even Oprah, diminish her voice. And it was that very life story, invisible but present, that was about to transform what could have been just another television moment into something unforgettable. For Crockett wasn't simply reacting to Oprah in that studio. She was channeling every lesson of her past, every struggle of her journey, into a single poised response. And when the cameras rolled, Jasmine Crockett's life story became her sharpest weapon. The air in the studio seemed to thicken as the confrontation pressed forward. Oprah, perhaps sensing that her initial lecture hadn't landed with the usual authority, leaned in again. Her tone grew sharper, her questions less like inquiries and more like indictments. She pressed harder, layering her words with the unmistakable cadence of someone determined to reassert control. For decades this strategy had worked flawlessly. An authoritative tone, a raised eyebrow, a perfectly timed pause that forced others into submission. But tonight, the rhythm was faltering. Jasmine Crockett sat motionless at first, her composure unbroken. She let Oprah's words echo, allowed them to hang in the space between them like smoke. The cameras caught the tension, Oprah's insistence colliding with Crockett's refusal to break. Finally, Crockett began to respond, not with a raised voice or flustered defense, but with precision. Each word she spoke was measured, deliberate, calm in a way that felt cutting. She didn't match Oprah's aggression, she undercut it. Her strategy was clear. While Oprah pressed with force, Crockett countered with clarity. Instead of showing offense, she turned Oprah's framing on its head. Each answer reframed the supposed lesson into a revelation about strength, resilience, and lived truth. The effect was undeniable. Crockett wasn't simply responding. She was redirecting the entire conversation, subtly shifting power away from the cultural giant seated across from her. Oprah's face betrayed the frustration she tried to mask. For the first time, her authority wasn't working. The usual applause lines fell flat, while Crockett's calm rebuttals drew murmurs from the audience. Some viewers leaned forward in their seats, caught between disbelief and admiration. They were watching something unusual, the unshakable force of a media titan encountering an immovable wall of authenticity. The energy began to tilt. Oprah raised her hand for emphasis, gesturing broadly as though sheer force of personality could bend the exchange back in her favor. But Crockett's quiet composure only made the contrast sharper. Oprah seemed rattled, Crockett seemed unbothered. With every calm reply, Crockett stole momentum, her words slicing through the atmosphere with the precision of a scalpel. And the audience noticed. Some gasped softly at the unexpected sharpness of Crockett's points. Others smiled, nodding as though someone had finally articulated what they had always wanted to say to figures of unchecked authority. The studio felt divided, some clinging to Oprah's legacy, others shifting toward the bold authenticity radiating from Crockett. But everyone felt the same thing: the energy in the room was shifting. Everyone could feel it. It was no longer a lecture. It was a battle, a collision between two very different kinds of power: the polished dominance of celebrity versus the grounded strength of lived truth. Oprah pushed harder, visibly straining to pull the narrative back under her control. Yet the more she pressed, the more her words began to feel defensive rather than commanding. Crockett's presence had altered the chemistry of the room, and the audience was reacting in real time. The clash was now more than a disagreement. It was symbolic. It was a test of whether America would still yield unquestioningly to celebrity authority, or whether a new generation, forged in struggle and authenticity, could stand its ground. With each passing second, Crockett was proving she wasn't just surviving the moment, she was reshaping it. And then, just when the tension reached its breaking point, Crockett leaned forward ever so slightly, eyes steady, voice firm but calm. What came next wasn't simply a response, it was a counterstrike, the kind of moment that would ripple far beyond the studio walls. Then came the moment that left Oprah stunned, and America cheering. For a moment, the studio fell into a strange kind of silence, not empty, but charged like the air right before lightning splits the sky. Oprah's voice had just trailed off, her lecture tightening into its sharpest point. All eyes turned to Jasmine Crockett. The expectation was simple: that she would soften, retreat, offer a polite nod of submission. But Crockett didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned forward, elbows resting lightly on the desk, gaze steady. Her composure radiated the kind of quiet power that makes even the loudest words tremble. She let the silence stretch, unhurried. Seconds ticked by, and in those seconds the balance of power began to tip. Viewers at home could feel it. The audience in the studio held its breath. Oprah's empire had always thrived on filling silences with her voice. But Crockett weaponized the silence, turning it into a stage for what was coming next. And then she spoke. Her voice wasn't raised, but it cut sharper than any shout. She began with a question, calm, almost disarmingly so. Oprah, do you know what it feels like to be told your place before you've even opened your mouth? The words landed with precision, slicing through the polished veneer of Oprah's authority. Gasps echoed softly from the crowd. Crockett didn't stop. She let her words roll out with rhythm, like waves building force as they reached the shore. She spoke of her life, her journey, the years spent in rooms where people assumed she didn't belong. She painted the picture of every lecture she had endured, every condescending smile, every dismissal disguised as advice. But instead of bitterness, she framed it as fuel, proof that her resilience was forged in fire. Her tone carried no resentment, only conviction. That was what made it sting. She wasn't fighting Oprah with anger, she was dismantling her with dignity. Crockett then pivoted, turning Oprah's lecture back onto its source. Without raising her voice, she pointed out the contradictions of being scolded by someone who once built her brand on uplifting voices from the margins. I respect what you've accomplished, Crockett said, steady and deliberate, but respect goes both ways. The same communities that raised you up, the same struggles you once represented, deserve more than condescension. They deserve to be heard. The words rang out like a bell. It wasn't a retort, it was a mirror Oprah couldn't look away from, and one the audience couldn't ignore. The reaction was immediate. A ripple of applause broke out, scattered at first, then building. People leaned forward in their seats, clapping, nodding, cheering under their breath. Cameras captured the flicker across Oprah's face, a flash of surprise, even discomfort. She shifted in her chair, her composure slipping just enough to reveal the sting. For the first time, she wasn't the unquestioned authority in the room. She was the one being challenged, and losing. Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't need to. Her body language spoke volume as relaxed posture, unwavering eye contact, a steady confidence that contrasted Oprah's restless shifting. She paused at key moments, letting her words breathe, allowing the audience to absorb each point before moving on. Every pause was strategic, every silence heavy with meaning. It was a masterclass not in volume, but in control. By the time she finished, the studio had transformed. The audience was no longer holding its breath, they were exhaling, clapping, some even standing in their seats. On social media, the moment was already being clipped, replayed, remixed. Tweets flew like sparks. Jasmine Crockett just ended Oprah on her own stage. This is what authenticity looks like. The clapback of the decade. Dignity over arrogance. Within minutes, hashtags began trending. Memes appeared, split-screening Crockett's calm face against Oprah's stunned reaction. Late-night hosts were already preparing their punchlines. What made it powerful wasn't cruelty. Crockett hadn't insulted, mocked, or demeaned. She had taken Oprah's attempt to lecture her and transformed it into a universal truth that no one, no matter how rich, how famous, or how powerful, has the right to silence another's dignity. She had shown that true authority doesn't come from empire. It comes from authenticity. Oprah tried to interject once, perhaps to regain footing. But the timing was off. Crockett's words had already landed, the applause had already rolled through, and the moment had already passed beyond Oprah's control. Her silence was louder than any comeback she could have mustered. For a woman who had mastered the art of commanding the stage, the sight was striking. Oprah, subdued, forced to sit in the shadow of someone else's truth. The studio buzzed with the electricity of what had just happened. People whispered to one another, phones lit up as clips were replayed in real time, and somewhere in that controlled television environment, the script had been flipped entirely. Jasmine Crockett hadn't just answered Oprah. She had rewritten the terms of the conversation. What was supposed to be a lecture turned into a reckoning. What was meant to diminish her had elevated her. And in doing so, she hadn't just stunned Oprah. She had given voice to millions who had long waited for someone to stand tall in the face of condescension. By the time the applause died down, there was no doubt left in the room. Crockett had won. Oprah was silenced, and the cameras had captured every second of it. But the true shock wasn't what happened in the studio. It was what came next across America. The studio lights dimmed, the cameras cut, and yet the story had only just begun. What happened on that stage didn't stay confined to one broadcast. It detonated across the digital landscape like a cultural earthquake. Within minutes, the hashtags began to climb. Faye Crockett clapback shot to the top of Twitter's trending list. Instagram Reels and TikTok edits flooded feeds, each replaying the moment Crockett calmly flipped Oprah's lecture back onto her. The clips looped with captions. "This is what grace under fire looks like. Authenticity wins every time." Memes spread like wildfire. Some showed Oprah mid-sentence with the caption, "She thought it was a lecture," followed by Crockett's steady gaze captioned, "But it became a lesson." Reaction videos poured in. Influencers, activists, even teenagers in bedrooms across the country recording their faces as they watched the moment unfold. Gasps, laughter, applause, cheers. Millions were reliving that confrontation as if it had happened in their own living rooms. Late-night comedy writers didn't waste a second. Monologues opened with lines like, "Oprah brought a lecture, but Crockett brought the syllabus." Audiences roared as clips played on screens behind the hosts. The cultural machine had seized on the moment, but this time, it wasn't just entertainment, it was symbolism. Crockett was being elevated into something larger than the exchange itself. Political figures entered the fray. Progressive lawmakers praised her composure, framing her as the embodiment of a new generation of leadership unafraid to challenge authority, even when it wore the face of cultural royalty. Jasmine Crockett reminded us tonight. One senator tweeted, "That dignity isn't granted from the top down, it's claimed from the ground up." Conservative commentators, meanwhile, scrambled to frame it as another celebrity feud gone woke, but their attempts only underscored the resonance of what had just happened. Celebrities chimed in. Musicians reposted clips with captions like, "This is the energy we need right now." Writers and cultural critics penned threads unpacking the deeper meaning. Oprah, the billionaire media mogul, once the voice of the marginalized, had unintentionally exposed the gap between legacy influence and lived authenticity. Crockett's response wasn't just a clapback. It was a reclamation of narrative, a refusal to be diminished by the very forces that had historically silenced voices like hers. The effect was instant and visceral. Polls of public sentiment, informal but widespread, declared Crockett the undisputed victor. Online forums buzzed with discussions of how she had carried herself, not as a firebrand or a showman, but as someone grounded in truth. People who had never before paid attention to her career were suddenly invested. Her follower count skyrocketed, campaign donations poured in, and her speeches began circulating as if she had already entered the pantheon of cultural icons. Oprah, for all her legacy, found herself on the defensive. Clips of her frowning reaction spread alongside Crockett's poised delivery. Think pieces questioned whether Oprah had strayed too far from her roots, whether her lecture revealed not wisdom but detachment. The woman who once held daytime audiences in the palm of her hand was now navigating headlines asking if she had finally misjudged the room. And yet, Crockett didn't need to say another word. Her silence after the confrontation spoke louder than any press statement could. She didn't rush to capitalize on the moment with a tweet storm or an interview blitz. Instead, she let the people carry it. That restraint only magnified her stature, making the moment feel even more like a shift in cultural gravity. By the end of the week, it was undeniable Crockett had become a symbol. Not just of a political figure holding her ground, but of a broader struggle: dignity under fire, authenticity against power, resilience against condescension. She represented the millions who had been told to wait their turn, to quiet down, to take notes from those who claimed to know better. In standing calmly against Oprah's lecture, she had flipped the script for all of them. News outlets scrambled to cover the phenomenon. Headlines declared, the clapback heard around the world. Editorials debated what it meant for generational power dynamics, for women of color in leadership, for the cultural influence Oprah once wielded without question. Crockett's name was no longer just political, it was cultural currency. The aftershocks rippled far beyond television or Twitter. In barbershops, coffee shops, college dorms, family kitchens, people replayed the moment and argued about what it meant. Some framed it as a passing clash of personalities. Others insisted it was a watershed the night authority itself was redefined. And while Oprah tried to recover, Crockett had already transformed the narrative. In the days that followed, as the dust settled and the headlines multiplied, Jasmine Crockett made her message clear. For her, this was never about scoring points against Oprah, never about humiliation or triumph in the shallow sense. She reframed the exchange not as a clash of personalities, but as a reminder that respect is not optional. It is the foundation of any meaningful dialogue. In a world where power too often disguises itself as wisdom, Crockett had shown that authenticity could cut sharper than any legacy. She began to speak not of Oprah directly, but of what that moment represented. "This wasn't about me," she said in a speech that quickly went viral. "It was about the millions of people who have been lectured, dismissed, told they didn't belong, only to rise anyway. It was about standing firm when the world expects you to bow." Her words struck a chord that echoed far beyond the political or cultural arena. This was about something larger, the universal truth that humility outlasts arrogance, and truth always outweighs power. The story became a parable. Parents shared the clip with their children as a lesson in dignity. Teachers referenced it in classrooms when discussing leadership. Faith leaders quoted it in sermons, framing it as a modern reminder of an ancient wisdom: the meek may not inherit the earth by silence, but by standing steady in the face of those who believe themselves untouchable. Crockett's composure had turned a fleeting television moment into something timeless. Even those who had once dismissed her began to acknowledge the resonance of what happened. Critics who wanted to reduce it to a spat between a rising politician and a cultural icon were forced to grapple with the fact that people weren't just entertained. They were moved. They saw themselves in Crockett's quiet defiance, her refusal to be diminished. It was less about what she said than how she said it, with calm precision, with dignity that refused to break under pressure. And that is what shifted the lesson. Oprah had intended a lecture, a moment to reassert authority, to guide from above, but what America saw was something different. The lecture became a lesson, but not the one she had scripted. It became a lesson in how power, when divorced from humility, collapses on itself, a lesson that respect must flow both ways, or else it ceases to have meaning. A lesson that even the most commanding voice can falter when it forgets to listen. For Crockett, the victory was not in silencing Oprah, but in showing that truth doesn't need volume to be heard. It only needs courage, and courage, once displayed, becomes contagious. Across the country, people spoke of how they found themselves standing a little taller at work, refusing to shrink in the face of condescension, remembering that one calm voice could transform an entire room. The underdog's moment, they realized, can come at any time, and when it does, it can flip the balance of power in an instant. This was the moral clarity of the story. Crockett had not set out to embarrass, but to endure. She had not sought to win a feud, but to honor her truth. In doing so, she showed the nation something that can't be scripted or manufactured: the undeniable strength of self-respect. And that strength, once witnessed, became a rallying point. As the narrative closed in on its final chapter, one line crystallized in the public imagination. Commentators repeated it, supporters tweeted it, and Crockett herself echoed it in her quiet, steady tone. What Oprah tried to use as a lecture became a lesson, but not the one she intended. It was more than a mic drop. It was a moral compass, pointing toward a truth that every person watching could carry with them. And in that moment, America understood the real power isn't in the lecture, it's in the dignity of the one who refuses to be diminished. Oprah tried to lecture, but it backfired instantly. That was the headline, the viral takeaway, the phrase that echoed across living rooms, classrooms, and timelines. Yet the true meaning of the moment went deeper than a single confrontation. It was about what happens when arrogance meets authenticity, when power without humility faces truth spoken with dignity. In that collision, the outcome is inevitable. Arrogance collapses, authenticity endures. Jasmine Crockett didn't just defend herself on live television. She reminded America that dignity is not negotiable. Her composure showed that even the most celebrated voices can falter if they forget to respect the people they're addressing. And her courage offered something rare, a moment of clarity in a world too often clouded by noise, ego, and performance. That's why this story resonates. It's not about who won the exchange. It's about what it revealed, that strength doesn't always shout, and that the quiet power of self-respect can shake even the highest pedestals. If you believe dignity always wins, then you're part of this story too. Subscribe, join the movement where dignity always wins. Don't just watch moments like this, be part of a community that amplifies them. Share if this inspired you, send it to someone who needs to see it. Maybe a friend who doubts their own voice, maybe a colleague who feels overshadowed. Show them that one calm, confident response can change everything. Comment, what does dignity mean to you? Tell us below. Your words matter, and your story deserves to be heard. Because in the end, this isn't just about Jasmine Crockett and Oprah Winfrey. It's about all of us. And it's about remembering, in every room, on every stage, that authenticity will always outlast arrogance.